Chapter 35, Part 4. The performance of the cantatas and passions continued. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 35, Part 4. The performance of the cantatas and passions continued. The modern orchestra has developed from the old by a process of selection. From each orchestral group, strings, wood, and brass, there have fallen out a number of intermediate instruments. Only the ones that were most perfect and capable of the most varied uses have stood their ground. People gave up the idea of having the same instrument in all possible registers and qualities. This reform, which at the same time implies a certain impoverishment, came from the Italians. Bach, although he was contemporary with this reform, ignored it. He employed instruments that were already becoming obsolete in his own day. Handel wrote for what was then the modern and more simplified orchestra. The brass instruments were naturally most affected by the reform, but a number of string instruments also fell into disuse. Bach still uses the violino piccolo, a small quartiege, the three-quarter violin. He makes it play in octaves with the ordinary violin. It plays a special role in the cantata Herr Christ der Einge Gottes schön, number 96, in which it has an obbligato part in conjunction with the piccolo flute. The gamba, which Bach employs in the Passions, is a six-stringed instrument, occupying a place between the cello and the viola. The viola d'amore, which he uses in the St. John Passion, somewhat resembles the viola. It had 7 strings. Under the gut strings, touched by the bow, the 3 deepest being overlaid with metal, were 7 metal strings, which increased the resonance. These gave the instrument its peculiarly beautiful timbre. The larger string instruments gave Bach a lot of trouble. Our contrabass, as yet, did not exist. The violoni and the violoni grosso, which he sometimes used in large choruses, were so imperfect that it was impossible to play his bass runs on them. Footnote: Bach's violoni could not play such basses. End footnote. The player was content to perform the principal notes, leaving the remainder to the celli and the other string instruments that cooperated an octave higher, the viola pomposa. Footnote: This instrument is never indicated in the scores. End footnote. Invented by Bach, and the violoncello piccolo. In the cantatas of Bach's later period, he often gives solo passages to the latter instrument. Footnote: It sounded an octave deeper than it was written. End footnote. What is the bearing of these facts on modern performances? The viola pomposa and the violoncello piccolo can easily be dispensed with. Bach employed them to bring out the bass more clearly. This can be done in other ways. It is partly secured, indeed, by the perfection to which the contrabass has now been brought. The violoncello piccolo solos can be played by any good cellist on his own instrument. When necessary, they can be divided between the cello and the viola. The loss of the viola d'amore is felt as a misfortune only in St. John Passion. It would be an advantage, however, if gamba playing were cultivated again, the cello and the viola, or the two together, being poor substitutes for the solos on this instrument. It will be noted that we are already beginning to realize the poverty of our string instruments and trying to remedy it. Viola players, who can also play the gamba, will probably be the rule in the future. The necessities of our modern orchestra will also compel us to look for string instruments with a higher range than the violin. Then we shall be able to perform the violin parts in many of Bach's scores in the way that makes them most effective, though he has not marked them so, that is, by doubling them with the octave above. In general, the arrangement that is equivalent to drawing a corresponding 4-feet register is quite in Bach's spirit. He himself doubles the cello in the octave, with the violoncello piccolo and the violin with the violino piccolo. Bach uses both the transverse flute and the flûte da becca. In his employment of the latter, he probably stood alone among the musicians of his time. He even uses it in his later works, for example, the cantata Herr Jesus Christ war Mensch und Gott, number 127, which dates from the end of the 30s. The disappearance of the flûte à bec is not a very great misfortune. It is one of the family of long flutes. It was constructed like the open flute pipe of the organ and blown in precisely the same way. A number of finger holes, 6 to 8, made it possible to produce various tones from this primitive instrument. Some of them were always rather impure, being obtained by only half closing the hole. The overtones being completely lacking, the timbre was soft but inexpressive. Footnote: there were various kinds of flûtes à bec, including heavy bass instruments. End footnote. The parts for flûte à bec hardly suffer at all from being played on the modern transverse flute. With regard to the general question of Bach's flute parts, it may be asked whether the metal flute is not preferable in many cases to the wooden flute. The metal flute, which the French mostly use, has the advantage of speaking more easily. In many solos it is certainly more effective than the wooden flute, which is almost exclusively used in Germany. In the choruses, however, the full round tone of the wooden flute is greatly to be preferred. It is thus best to employ them together. The question of the oboe in Bach performances is not nearly so complicated now as it was a little while ago. Formerly, the oboe d'acacia and the oboe d'amore had both to be replaced by the cor anglais, which does extremely well for the oboe d'acacia, but is a poor makeshift for the oboe d'amore, the tone of the instrument Bach had in view being much softer and more tender. Footnote: the oboe d'amore is practically an alto oboe. End footnote. In the meantime, the oboe d'amore has come into use again in the modern orchestra. 5 instruments of this type are now made, which any reasonable good oboe player can master without much difficulty. The many beautiful passages for the oboe d'amore in Bach's works are only truly expressive when played as he intended them. Even the ordinary hearer at once perceives the difference. The question of the brass instruments is a very complicated one. Bach employs the trombone, the cornetto, the trumpet, and the horn. In his epoch there was a complete family of trombones: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Footnote: the trombone slide is first mentioned by Zarlino in 1588. End footnote. These instruments were capable of much purer tone than the trumpets, but could only be used in long-drawn passages. The town musicians employed them in choruses. Similarly, Bach does not use them in the orchestra, but only to accompany motet-like choruses. Each vocal part has its corresponding trombone. See, for example, the opening chorus of Ach Gott vom Himmel schied der ein, number 2. Bach frequently substitutes the cornetto for the descant trombone, in this again following the practice of the town bands. The cornetto was an instrument with a bell-shaped mouthpiece and usually an S-shaped tube of wood wrapped round with leather. The serpent was a member of this family. It was simply the bass cornetto. Footnote: the lightus, used in the cantata O Jesu Christ mein Lebenslicht, number 118, probably also belonged to the cornetto family. End footnote. The discount cornetto had 7 holes, so that, as with the flûte à bec, the player had to get the full scale by only partially closing some of the holes. Under these circumstances, several of the tones were bound to be impure. The cornetto had a clear and not very strong tone, a mixture of the timbres of the trumpet and the woodwind. Bach certainly used it to support the cantus firmus in the large chorale choruses in many places where it is not indicated either in the score or the parts. For the wind players, of course, knew the chorale melody by heart. In the motet choruses accompanied by the wind, it is best to employ the bugle for the soprano and alto trombones. The parts for the tenor and bass trombones can be played on the original instruments, the slide trombones being preferable to the valve trombones. Footnote. In England, the slide trumpet that is still in use there can probably be employed. End footnote. It should be observed that the trombones of that day, being smaller, were not so strong as ours, but had a brighter tone, as our choirs are much heavier than those of Bach's day. However, the proportions are preserved. If it is impossible to employ the brass, these motet choruses may be supported simply by the woodwind and strings, the former in as large numbers as possible. In any case, the effect will be satisfactory. Footnote. In this case, the experiment may be tried of adding the reeds of the organ. End footnote. If the upper part is a chorale, the trumpet may always take this. There can hardly be any doubt that all the chorale melodies used in the choruses, with the exception of the final chorales, should be reinforced by the trumpet, even where the score has no indication to this effect. There used to be the most confused opinions current upon the trumpet and upon the technique that Bach demanded of its players. This confusion was ended by the thorough researches of Eichborn. One error in particular needs to be cleared away: that things were possible on the old natural trumpet that are impossible on the present valve trumpet. The runs that Bach writes for his players were about as difficult on their instruments as they are on ours. The only difference is that his players were well practiced in them, while ours are not. The natural trumpet, the only one known in those days, consisted of a cylindrical tube with a thin conical opening at the top. It was generally bent and curved something like the cavalry trumpet of today. The C and D trumpets were the most frequently used. The open tube of a trumpet of this kind gave the ground tone, the octave, the fifth, the pure fourth, the major third, the minor seventh, the major second, then a diatonic scale not quite pure in the fourth octave, and a chromatic scale in the fifth octave from the ground tone. These notes have been retained in the trumpet and can be produced theoretically by varying degrees of force in the breath pressure and the varying movements of the lips, which here correspond to the reed mouthpiece of the oboe. As the two lower octaves are poor, use was made only of some tones in the middle and the penultimate diatonic octave. The diatonic octave could be still further enriched, as on the C trumpet, F could be blown F sharp, G, G sharp, and B flat, B natural. The practicable tones were therefore the four notes of the third octave, reckoned from the ground tone, the diatonic scale of the fourth octave with F sharp, G sharp, and B. Footnote. The diatonic octave could have been further enriched by stopping, a device derived from the technique of the horn. In Bach's time, however, this was not thought of. End of footnote. Of the fifth chromatic octave, the first four diatonic tones were the most important, since the other intervals, though theoretically complete, could not be obtained owing to the difficulty of getting the necessary fineness of lip pressure. Yet, in the second Brandenburg Concerto, Bach demands from the solo trumpet the fifth diatonic note of this octave, the G. Eichborn gives the following as the scale. The mysterious art of clarino playing. Footnote. In the 17th and early 18th centuries a distinction was made between the players of the upper and of the lower trumpet parts, the former being called clarino, the latter principale. End footnote. Therefore consisted of nothing more than the mastery of these tones by incessant practice from youth upwards. Bach's reason for writing his parts so high was that these were the only notes that were at all complete on the instruments of that epoch. The player was helped by the easy speaking of his simple and delicately constructed instrument and its narrow dimensions. Footnote: the narrower the trumpet, the easier are its high notes, and the more difficult its lower ones. The former are of fine quality, while the middle and lower register are dry. End footnote. Moreover, he employed a special mouthpiece for playing in the high register. The smoother that is, and the sharper its angle, the easier and more certain are the attack and the articulations of the high notes. According to Eichborn, the following would be the ideal shape for the mouthpiece in clarino playing. Small diagram. As a matter of fact, it does not alter the tone wholly for the better. In the higher register, it becomes dry and lacking in expression. We cannot therefore suppose the contemporary rendering of Bach's trumpet parts to have been ideal. As the above table shows, a number of tones remained impure even in the best circumstances. Others were uncertain. The timbre in the upper register was not beautiful, resembling that of a child's trumpet. The one advantage of the instrument, and it is a very great advantage with regard to Bach's orchestration, was that its tone was weaker than that of the trumpet of today. An oboe, or certainly two oboes, could hold their own against it quite well. After the practice ceased of writing scores in purely obbligato parts, that is to say, after the middle of the 18th century, there was no motive for the study of clarino playing. About the same time, the town bands also became extinct. At the end of the century, valve trumpets began to be made in England and Germany. From these there developed the modern instrument. Our trumpet really unites several instruments in one. The arrangements of crooks and valves allowing the player to lengthen or shorten the tube at will. Footnote: the three valves of the modern trumpet correspond in their combinations to 7 positions. End footnote. By combining the serviceable diatonic notes of these various trumpets, we get the complete chromatic scale. The nature of the trumpet is not altered in any way. As before, the performer plays on the natural trumpet. Only by a pressure of the finger he places to his mouth each time the trumpet produces the desired note, most easily and purely. Footnote: it should be observed, however, that the lower third cannot be produced on the valve trumpet as a natural note. End footnote. And on this adaptable instrument he can do whatever is possible on the natural trumpet. Of course, the other conditions must be fulfilled. When some musicians were discussing the possibility of playing Bach's trumpet passages and expressing every possible theory on the subject, Gevaert, the director of the Brussels Conservatoire, dryly interjected that it was une question d'embouchure et d'entraînement. That is the whole point. It is simply a question of the mouthpiece and technique. With the ordinary mouthpiece, Bach's higher notes cannot be easily and surely played. Flatter ones make them possible. It is a matter of finding the right type and of our players' lips becoming accustomed to it. It cannot be too flat if beauty of tone is desired. Footnote: after some years of research and experiment, the trumpeter of the Brussels Conservatoire has constructed a special mouthpiece for performing the Bach and Handel trumpet parts. Of course, the art of producing the high notes purely and easily is not to be learned in a day. Still less can a Bach trumpet part be played at sight at rehearsal, nor, when this proves impossible, should it be declared unplayable. If there ever comes a generation of players who practice Bach from the commencement, and make a special study of the higher register and of the lip technique demanded by the flat mouthpiece, people will be astonished at the long prevalence of the view that Bach wrote unplayable trumpet parts. It must be admitted that the valve trumpet, as it is constructed today, rather increases the difficulty of blowing. The complicated path taken by the column of air as it passes through one of the crooks hinders its free vibration. The attack of the note is not so natural as in the normal trumpet, where the air path is not so circuitous. This inconvenience, however, can be greatly diminished by making the tubes as thin and delicate as possible, and by avoiding all superfluous apparatus for the evacuation of moisture and all unnecessary solderings. By these means the vibratory capacity of the valve trumpet may be made not much less than that of the natural trumpet. The proper performance of Bach's trumpet parts demands, therefore, very lightly built and narrow valve trumpets, special mouthpieces, tested in every detail, and particularly practiced players. Footnote: it must not be forgotten that the trumpeters of Bach's day had a much more practiced ear than modern players have for the intervals that are produced solely with the lips. End footnote. We may affirm, however, that even the ordinary performances of the present day are in many respects better than those of Bach's players, the tones being purer and more certain. We can therefore put up with a certain sluggishness of tone in the higher notes. Until the ideal Bach trumpet comes, we should employ, in the cantatas, the trumpet in D, for which Bach usually writes. The trumpets in high D made by Alexander of Mainz may be recommended. They not only greatly lighten the task of the player who is accustomed to them, but produce a tone which, particularly in the higher register, is much softer than the ordinary. It has already been remarked, in discussing the Brandenburg concertos, that the firm's trumpet in high F is the best for the second concerto. But a good player should not despair if he cannot play the part easily on the new instrument after several weeks' practice. Familiarity is a matter not of weeks and months, but of years. It is more than doubtful whether Bach had trumpet parts of this kind performed by one player only. Eichborn draws attention to the number of trumpets employed in an orchestra in that epoch, and conjectures, perhaps rightly, that they shared difficult passages between them, each of them taking a short section. Whether this view be right or wrong historically, the plan recommends itself. It is barbarous to expect our trumpeters to play a Bach part from beginning to end. From artistic considerations alone, we ought to employ two, since the moment a wind player becomes ever so little fatigued, he loses his certainty in high passages. The demands made on the trumpeters in a Bach performance are so severe because the same player, if he belongs to an orchestra, has so recently had to produce the deeper tones required from the trumpet in modern compositions. We shall probably come to a time when wind players will specialize for Bach and Handel, and will be as much sought after and as well paid as the solo singers. When no good trumpeters are to be had, it is always best to give the higher trumpet part to 2 or 3 C or D clarinets, or at all events to resort to the assistance of these in the high notes. It should be mentioned that in his earlier works Bach writes for the trumpet in a more fanfare-like and less obbligato style than in his later ones. These early parts are really the finest and most effective that he ever wrote for the instrument. An example may be seen in the cantata Es erhab sich ein Streit, number 19. Whether, even with good instruments and good players, we can ever be made to enjoy the arias accompanied by 2 or 3 trumpets is another question. But till this time comes, we must not revolt at the device of substituting the woodwind for the brass, out of pity for the voice, when there is only one singer. The question of the horn is similar to that of the trumpet. It was only a little time before Bach's death that the muting of the horn was achieved by the Bohemian Anton Hambel. Bach is acquainted only with the simple cornoracacia, the hunting horn, that had come into use in Paris at the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th. Thus the hornist, like the trumpeter, had to use special mouthpieces for the high notes. In connection with Bach, it is therefore more correct to speak of a trumpet in the form of a horn than of a real horn. The timbre of the modern horn is somewhat duller than what Bach had in view. If the part is a high one, it is as well to divide it between horn and trumpet, since only the finest horn virtuosi can produce the upper tones well. The bugle, if the player is at all master of his instrument, gives better results than one is commonly inclined to suppose. It may be observed that even experienced musicians among the audience wonder at the flexibility of the runs, without suspecting that it is not the ordinary horn that is playing. Footnote. This, of course, is only a makeshift until such time as our hornists shall again be expert in the higher registers. End footnote. As the tone of the modern trumpet and horn is stronger than that of the instruments of Bach's day, we must see that we get the right relation between the brass on the one side and the strings and wood on the other. Every voice in a Bach score counts for as much as the others. But this is true not only of the orchestral parts among themselves, but of these in relation to the voice parts. The flute part must come out just as clearly as that of the soprani in the choir. The true essence of a Bach score does not consist in the accompaniment of the chorus by the orchestra, but in the cooperation of a vocal mass and an instrumental mass of equal significance with it. In the performances under Bach himself, indeed, the orchestral part was in the ascendant. In a festival cantata there were 18 or 20 instruments to 12 singers. But even on the ordinary occasions he had at least as many first and second violins as soprani and alti, if not more, as is shown by the fact that the parts for those instruments are frequently written out in duplicate, which is not often the case with the vocal parts. Nor must we forget that the slight attention of the bow in those days led to a much smaller tone being drawn from the violin than is customary today. It is in this light that we must consider our present practice of performing Bach's cantatas with choirs of 200 voices. It was mistakenly assumed to be self-evident that the orchestra should be quite weak in comparison with the choir, and should be practically inaudible when the latter ended. Those who were conscious of this disproportion felt the need for reorchestration of the works which they often carried out. The most natural solution of the problem, however, is to strengthen the instrumental parts in proportion to the numbers of the choir. There was nothing in the modern view to negate an increase in the number of the strings, but the advocates of reorchestration made merry over the proposal to employ with a large choir a dozen oboes, a dozen flutes, and half a dozen bassoons, and ridiculed the idea of asking a modern audience to listen to a bellowing of this kind. This, however, did not disconcert the advocates of performances in accordance with the original score. Siegfried Och, in particular, fought gallantly both with word and deed for the right principle. His performances have shown that it is possible to get an instrumental equivalent to a large chorus without any reorchestration, simply by using the proper number of instruments, and that an orchestra of this kind, if efficiently handled, is not in the slightest degree unwieldy. The old notion that Bach's music cannot be performed just as it is written will probably die out by degrees. We still, however, occasionally meet with a choral conductor who, when a beautiful cantata is recommended to him, immediately asks whether there is an arrangement of it published, which shows how our self-reliance has been destroyed by these arranged editions. As the tone of our instruments is much stronger than that of the older ones, and some of the numbers of our mixed choirs do not count at full strength, something like the following disposition of the orchestra may be recommended for a choir of 50 to 80 voices: 6 first violins, 6 seconds, 6 violas, 4 cellos, 2 contrabasses, 2 flutes, and 2 oboes for each part. For a choir of 100 to 150 voices, the following would be the ideal: 10 first violins, 10 seconds, 10 violas, 6 cellos, 4 contrabasses, 6 flutes, and 6 oboes for each part. Even at the end of the 18th century, it was taken for granted that the orchestra was to be hardly numerically weaker than the choir. Hiller had an enormous orchestra at the famous performance of The Messiah at Berlin in 1788. After the size, the disposition of the orchestra is of prime importance. The customary arrangement with the orchestra thrust like a wedge into the choir is perhaps not the best for a Bach performance. The strings and woodwind are better placed in front of the choir. Only in this way can the proper effect be secured. Footnote: to increase the effect of the woodwind, they should be placed in the forefront before the violins. End footnote. It is a mistake for the conductor to make the orchestra play piano at the entry of the chorus, which he sometimes does in accordance with modern custom, or because the instruments sound too loud where he is standing. It is very seldom that a listener in the church or the concert room finds the orchestra too loud in a Bach chorus. It much more frequently happens that he simply does not hear it at all. It cannot be too often repeated that in a Bach performance it is not a question of an accompanying orchestra, but of the cooperation of a vocal choir and an instrumental choir, the latter playing, if anything, the leading role. End of chapter 35, part 4. The performance of the cantatas and passions continued.